Hi, this is State Senator Jill P. Carter, and you are listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of news and notes on Maryland politics and policy. The Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Sarah Sample, Associate Policy Director here at MACO, and a very special guest. We have with us Director Brandon Foster of the Charles County Detention Center. We're lucky to have Director Foster with us today. We're going to talk about local jails and how they differ from prisons. We're going to get into some policy issues and just sort of what's going on the ground in a local county detention center, because I think a lot of that is going to translate across the state. Director Foster, thank you so much for being with us. Can I call you Director Foster, or do you prefer Brandon?
Brandon would be fine.
Okay, thank you, Brandon.
Awesome. And I would just jump in. We don't want to go any further before we tell you how lucky we really are to have Brandon with us today. So let me run down the specs for our audience real quick. So Director Foster is a 25-year veteran of the Charles County Detention Center. He began his career in 1997 as a line staff correctional officer and shortly after became a staff instructor at the Southern Maryland Criminal Justice Academy, where he was a sergeant supervising recruits in training. He later served as a sector supervisor in the custody and security section and was then promoted to lieutenant, overseeing a team of officers assigned to that division. He is now the director of the Charles County Detention Center. And prior to Director Foster's corrections career, he served in the United States Marine Corps as a staff sergeant, where he was active duty from 1990 to 1995 and in the reserves from 2003 to 2007.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much and welcome again. And thanks for your service. You certainly have a very, very robust resume, and you seem like the perfect person to sort of get into local corrections issues. So let's start off by hearing, about your own journey. Sarah outlined a lot of it. It sounds like you've had quite a career so far. So tell us just a little bit about how you ended up in corrections, what brought you into this profession, and why do you love it?
Sure. Good afternoon, both Kevin and Sarah. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's my pleasure to speak with you. There's actually one little piece I would add to the bio. When I was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps in 1995, I always knew that a career in uniform would probably be the direction I would go, and wasn't sure whether police work or corrections work was the right fit for me. I took what was first available, and the little gap I'm filling in is I began my career in 1997 here at the Charles County Detention Center with the Charles County Sheriff's Office in Maryland. I did about 2 years where I started my career in corrections at a regional jail in Virginia, Northern Neck Regional Jail. And what I realized in a short amount of time after starting in this profession was I realized how important it was, how consequential it is to public safety. And it really began to open my eyes to a profession that I didn't know a lot about. And I don't think a lot of the public knows about, really. And, before long, I started setting my sights long term on a career in corrections. It took me from Northern Neck Regional Jail in Virginia to the Charles County Detention Center, and I've been here, as was stated, for about 26 years. I thoroughly enjoy the work I do. Again, it's very consequential to public safety, and we take great pride in what we do. We promote what we do, and we thoroughly enjoy talking to the public about what we do, because it's important to educate the public. It's important to educate our legislature here in Maryland. And so that's kind of how my career started and where I am today.
Awesome. Well, and I would also add that this is a particularly pertinent time for this discussion, because every legislative session, there are bills that get introduced to adjust policies for correctional institutions. And it's a common theme that local facilities get written into bills that make sense for big state facilities, but are sometimes impractical or even impossible for the small local facilities for a variety of reasons. And typically those can be financial, structural, operational barriers, and so on. In this past session, there were a handful that fell into this category. So on later episodes, we'll go into more of those nuances and explore why and how some things work and others don't from a policy perspective. But to be ready for that deep dive, we really need to know the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here.
Yes. As you mentioned, every year the legislative session brings challenges. We often are put in situations with the legislative session in Maryland where bills are being presented that haven't been carefully explored and conversations and discussions with local jails and prisons in regard to operations, budgets, resources. So yeah, there's that challenge every year. It would be great for the local detention center officials to have probably better communication overall with all of the groups that have that are stakeholders in some of these bills that we see. I think that it's what the public generally and some of the politicians, would benefit from as far as being educated on corrections is understanding the difference between local jails, the resources that local jails have, how we're funded, and state prisons. And there are many differences. There are even a lot of differences between even the local jails and how they're operated from county to county.
Right. And I think that's a great point, Brandon. And that's something I wanted to get into right off the bat, because I think there is a misconception and people often say, oh, this person's going to go to prison, even if they're actually going to go to a local jail. And there is a big difference there. And I also want to just chime in. I agree with you 1000%. I think on every policy issue, it's really important to have collaboration, to talk to people. We know that it takes many times, many years to pass a bill. And I think that's for good reason, right? Because it takes time to get the right people to the table to figure out what is doable, what isn't, how things can work here, but not there. And that's a great segue into just the difference between a local jail and a prison. So let's talk about that and a little bit about the basics of county jails. What type of offenses can land someone in a local correctional facility? How long are people typically staying? And then I think what's really important is to talk about the services that you provide to inmates, because I think that's pretty eye-opening as well. And a lot of people don't understand just how many hats you have to wear at a local correctional facility.
Sure. If I could walk us through kind of a general kind of flow chart here. So jails, local jails in Maryland, all of the 23 counties in Maryland have a local detention center. And of course, then we're talking on the other, in comparison, we're talking about the State Division of Correction, which is a state department under the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. So local jails, you have to imagine it's the entry point to the criminal justice system in the sense that when a crime is committed and there is an arrest, whatever county you're in, that defendant is first brought before a hearing. And if they are committed or held in a local detention facility, the commitment is the order by which we hold them. And so they enter into the local jail, and then there's all sorts of processes that begin. There's the legal process, which could, if you're pretrial and you're waiting trial during that time, you're held without bond. It's sort of indefinite. It depending on the courts in each county, that timeline is undetermined. Of course, there'll be all of the legal processes that are gone through, but a person could stay here in a pretrial status at a local jail for an undetermined amount of time while they go through that legal proceeding. Of course, if they get sentenced upon conviction, the judge may sentence them to either local time. In other words, they'll serve their sentence in the local detention center. And under Maryland statute, that generally is an 18-month or less, 18 months or less sentence. Generally, sentences longer than 18 months are done in the Division of Correction. So it would be a transfer. If it was a more than 18 months sentence, we would get the order and then we would make the arrangement for transfer to the State Division of Correction. If they serve the time here, generally under 18 months, the process begins where we classify based on the conviction, the sentence, And then there's all sorts of other elements to detention that go on. And I'll get into that in a second. So as far as who we hold, because it's the entry point, a local jail, a lot of people don't understand this, is all classification levels. Anything from a traffic offense all the way through a serious crime such as murder, robbery, assault, rape. So as far as classification of inmates, it's everything from minimum security all the way through maximum security. So your local jails are maximum security facilities in that sense. We have all classification levels. The Division of Correction, which is several prisons throughout the state. There's certain areas that have, a couple prisons like Hagerstown, Maryland, or Jessup. In the prison, after a person's been sentenced to a sentence generally more than 18 months, they're transferred to Division of Correction, and their prisons are designated by classification. So the whole prison might be a minimum security prison, or medium security prison, or maximum security prison. So they're separated out mostly along the institutions themselves. Here, they're all contained in one local detention center, and we have to classify them, which really complicates, how we separate. And this is where we run into the problems, the local jails. Some of our local jails were built decades ago. They were outfitted and built and constructed in a way that worked then. And many institutions have outgrown that. They've had, many institutions have to build on wings and expand necessarily over the years. And it becomes a very complicated process. Now, how they're funded, obviously, the state budget funds and resources the State Division of Correction, but there's a lot of strain on the 23 counties, especially some of the rural counties, in funding and resources to maintain and operate a local jail. Our operating budget here is about $21 million a year for Charles County, and depending on which county you go to, some are much larger, some are smaller. Some of the other things you need to understand about local jails is many of them are still run or fall under the authority of the sheriff's office in a particular county, but that's not always the case. Some of our bigger counties, Prince George's County, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, those local detention centers in those counties are a separate division within local government. They don't fall under the sheriff's office. Here in Charles County, we're under the command of the office of the sheriff. Right. It depends on county to county. They all look different, and so they operate differently. They're funded a little differently sometimes. But that I hope that gives a snapshot of sort of the difference between the local jails and the state.
Definitely. And I would say too, something you just, brought to light for me is just the vast difference in offenses and security levels that are in some local facilities that would differ from a place that is designated as minimum or maximum, which brings me to the services thought, where when you have that many different types of people and you're providing services, like that sounds like that could get complicated, especially when you have the actual facility is segmented based on those security levels. So could you tell us a little bit about the services and things that are provided to individuals while they're there? Oh, and what's the average stay? Do you know what the average stay is for a local jail?
For a local jail, I can speak to Charles County. Our average stay here is about 30 days. Now, how do I get that average? It's number of persons that entered the jail, just breaking it down on an average of stay. And so pre-trial, often it could be a couple days. A person gets arrested, a person sees the district court commissioner, has a hearing to determine release conditions. And after a couple days or maybe a couple hours, a person is released back into the community, either on a personal recognizance or some sort of a bond or condition. If they are kept longer, there may be a bond review that takes place after that, or other court proceedings where a person might be released after a short period of time. But on the average, in a local jail, you're probably looking at about 30 to 45 days. So that would be the average stay.
Okay. And then what kind of services would people be looking at for a stay that's maybe average or above? Yeah,
so services vary from local jail to local jail. we have always had very robust services. Our mission first is the safe, humane safekeeping of persons that are committed to our institution. But the second side of our mission is to be a positive influence on the lives of the persons that we are responsible for, to hopefully safely and return them to the community better than they were. So we have a multitude of services. There are religious services where we rely on volunteers. There are substance abuse services where we rely on counselors and all sorts of people that have expertise, peer mentors in that area. Educational and vocational. Here in Charles County, we have agreements with the College of Southern Maryland, where we regularly conduct classes that help with vocational, such as flagger courses, confined space certifications in first aid and CPR. So we are always, seeking to advance the resources we have to help people. And here recently we developed a partnership here in Charles County with the local library. So the public library now, they call it a branch. The inmate library that we have here is resourced and supervised by librarians from a local public library. So it enhances that. The mental health services are super important. And it will probably segue into a good conversation that we can have here today that, the biggest challenges over, let's say, the past 10 years, Maryland has seemed to be an ever-increasing problems with substance abuse and offenders in the state. Along with that, the mental health care that we provide has become heavily relied upon in Charles County and in most counties because there is still a struggle at the state level with resourcing the proper number of beds that we need in our state hospitals, mental health hospitals, to take these patients. So oftentimes, by default, the local detention center becomes sort of the de facto mental health institution in the meantime. So our officers are trained at a basic level, but then there are so many other aspects to their job. They sort of serve as counselors. They serve as liaison to mental health services and liaison to the substance abuse services. So it's wide ranging.
Yeah. And that library one, I think I saw that recently, and it sounds like such a wonderful initiative because it's about focusing on childhood literacy, but also connecting a parent that's incarcerated with their kid. And I read that you could record the parent reading to the kid, and then they'll send the file home with a copy of the book and a bear and or some sort of stuffed animal. And I thought that was just really creative and just so meaningful and really humanizing, I think. So,
it's a pretty neat thing that we partnered with them in what you just stated there, is that we know that literacy is usually below levels, with many of the persons that we are caring for. And we want to improve that. We know that literacy brings confidence. We know that literacy certainly gives people confidence when it comes to employment and job interviews and filling out applications, doing things that are necessary to maintain good employment. But then there's the extra stuff like what you just mentioned. We're hoping to have book clubs where some of the public library staff are conducting book clubs with groups of inmates, encouraging them to read more often. And we even have what you just mentioned, the opportunity for inmates to be able to read a book to their child and be able to send that to them in a recording. And that way it, hopefully is providing that connection to a child that they may not have seen in a while.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think you hit on a number of weighty issues there. The first being that not just in Maryland, but I think nationally, we're failing at making sure we provide resources to people who need mental health and addiction treatment. And by default, those people often end up in our local correctional facilities, and they probably don't need to be there. A lot of these people, right? This is not the right setting for them, but because the nation is failing at providing these services, this is just the default. There's nowhere else to go. And so they often end up in your facility and facilities across the state. So that's an extreme challenge. And it's one that costs a lot of money to address. And there are just a number of issues that are thorny and that really make this a very challenging issue. And I think it's really good to hear about the services you're providing, because oftentimes I think people also lose sight of the fact that a correctional facility is not just meant to take somebody off the street, but the goal is to rehabilitate, right? And to provide services so that when they get back on the street, they're able to better themselves and they're able to find a job and they're able to keep a job and they're able to provide for themselves and their family. And so these kind of resources are essential, but they also cost money, right? And I think that's a good transition to get in to sort of policy here. And we've already talked about, each legislative session here in Maryland, there are a number of bills that are looking to change or reform the way things are done in county facilities. And typically that does lack communication or coordination with local jails. I know that Sarah works a lot with you and your affiliate, and that helps to bridge that gap, but we can certainly do a better job. So I want to get into a little bit about your role during the legislative session, you and your colleagues. And I know that you track bills, you respond to fiscal note requests. So tell us a little about your role with the MCAA, or that's the Maryland Correctional Administrators Affiliate, and their legislative committee. And I guess first, the first step would be to tell our listeners, what is the MCAA and how does it work? And how does your legislative committee take positions, track bills, and then coordinate with groups such as Mako and Sarah so that we can be on the same page and help you advocate and get your message across to legislators?
Yes, Kevin. I appreciate the question. I'll back up just a little bit, just so everybody out here in Maryland understands, especially, let me just take mental health, for example. Local jails are stretched to the limit, both in resources and budgets, and especially some of our rural counties on the Eastern Shore in Western Maryland. They just do not have the same operating budgets as some of our larger Central Maryland counties. That being said, when it comes to contractual like medical services and mental health services and counselors, all of these things cost money. So there are limits to what we can provide. I can tell you that, I talk about mental health and it being such a lingering problem with us in the local jail for some time. The state, again, there's a struggle where the state doesn't have enough beds, but you need to understand that, or people in Maryland need to understand that many times, as you said, the local jail's probably not the place the person suffering from mental illness should be. But often there's homelessness involved, there's substance abuse involved with that person. And a lot of times these are misdemeanor, low-level crimes, but they become a nuisance to the public in that community, that county. And ultimately, there's no other recourse. They end up in jail, they're charged. And, the court orders a competency exam, and the law says they're to be transferred within 10 days. And often that average is more like 30, 45 days. And we have to manage that. And it takes a lot of resources to do that until they can be properly transferred to a hospital.
Yeah,
so
that kind of
thing
is expensive.
Yes, very expensive, and it's challenging sometimes. Sometimes it can be, when somebody decompensates a little bit while they're struggling with mental illness, there are challenges that come with that, and our staff have to day in and day out meet those challenges.
And I do want to say, you mentioned staff. And so I think it's important too. We know that a lot of the folks that are in your custody are struggling, but that also has to have an effect on your staff, right? I mean, day after day, dealing with folks that need other resources, but maybe can't get them from other places. And, a lot of these people are probably, repeat customers, right? They're in and out of the local correctional facility. That's got to take a toll on your correctional officers and your staff who deal with this every day. And we already know this is a really hard job and it's really hard to recruit and retain, but that has to take a toll mentally and physically on your staff as well, right?
It absolutely does, and I'll tell you, it's probably good to have a little more conversation about restrictive housing and how we manage and classify inmates while we're dealing with those challenges. That we can do that in another segment. I'd love to, but I'll just sort of mention that even this year we're seeing a bill in Annapolis in regard to restrictive housing. We've seen that bill before. But man, when it comes to our staff, our officers that are having to, care for and supervise and manage persons that are suffering from mental illness in the local jail, sometimes that management requires certain things. And this is where I think we need better communication with our legislature and helping everyone understand those challenges, allowing them to see those challenges firsthand. So ultimately, we're doing the right thing. We're heading in the right direction. We want to make sure that our limits of things like restrictive housing are in place, but you have to understand the realities of the management that takes place to keep people safe. Not only the person who is suffering from mental illness, but other people in the jail as well. So I'll move on to the MCAA because that's where they come in. The Maryland Commission on, the Maryland Correctional Administrators Association has been around since the late 70s. A well-established association of wardens, deputy wardens, and other correctional professionals across the state that advocate for our profession, advocate for safe and efficient jail operations. And so, we've been heavily involved in the legislative processes since the inception of the association. I serve on the subcommittee or legislative committee for the MCAA. And so, for several years, I've been pretty heavily involved in all the legislative processes when it's in session. The MCAA is a strong voice in the state, and we are mostly concerned with the things that would negatively affect us in our operations. So that's, again, we've talked about communication with people across the state. We seek to do that, and we seek to educate to the best of our ability and to promote what we do. And
I would just add for listeners, having an association that is very focused on legislation during the session is a very common thing. So we have the county health officers that do that, the county attorneys and park directors, with the goal of really giving feedback and taking a position based on whether or not we think that policy would work based on the realities that we're facing every day. So I also think we can't expect every legislator to know, about these sort of unbelievable variants and how the counties operate and the needs therein. So it's not just an opportunity to share the local perspective with them, but also help these elected officials understand, what an incredible resource these organizations can be. But also way before you get into session, way before you start writing the bills. And so, at least from my perspective, I think if I were a legislator, I think seeking this information out even before the session, before we start writing the bills, would be really beneficial ultimately.
Yes, Sarah, that's a good point. Very important. I don't, where else do you get the right information unless you're talking to the people that are doing the work? And so that's where we stand. We encourage that conversation and dialogue with people that are lawmakers, because we want the right thing. We want the thing that works. We want this to be in the best interest of the citizens of the state of Maryland, both for budgets and resources and just good policy. So especially what we're doing in the realm of public safety is in the best interest of those that we care for and the best interest of those who do this work to be able to, again, do it safely and effectively. I think too often, I'm not taking a shot at advocacy groups, but there's so many, groups out there that have interest, and often there's so many, misconceptions about what we do and what the operations of a local jail especially look like. It goes back to where we started. A lot of people group it together with the prison and prison operations. And maybe it's because they've seen these things portrayed in movies or on TV and in crime shows and all these things, which are just not a good picture of what actually happens in a jail. Often I know I encourage it. Our delegation here in Southern Maryland, whether it's a tour, whether it's a conversation, there's an invitation is always open for the local officials in my state delegation here in Southern Maryland come and visit and really, really, really get the information they need so these things are done wisely.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, I've had the opportunity to visit and tour a few correctional facilities across the state, and I'll tell you, it's pretty eye-opening. It is nothing like you see on TV and how, or nothing like a prison. And I think it's also important just to see the strain that your staff have to go through. The one thing I took away from, I think I've been to 3, is just how loud it was, right? There's just always noise, and not that people are rowdy, it's just a lot of people in one place, and people are hanging out, and there's different groups, and it's a very anxious atmosphere for me, at least. But I can't even imagine having to supervise all of these folks that are doing different things throughout the day, different levels of crimes, trying to make sure that you're not mixing the wrong people together. I mean, there are a lot of things that you have to consider. So I agree. I think if you want to understand a local correctional facility, the best way to do it is to actually visit and ask questions and be on the ground and understand what's going on, especially before you drop a bill. You want to do that, in my opinion, and it's really important to sort of get that experience and talk to the people who do this job every single day. That's most important, and that's not just in corrections, that's across the board. But I think ultimately it's probably most important in a job, in a role like yours, sir, where these are very, very challenging times and challenging circumstances that you deal with every day. And before somebody wants to change or enact a new policy, I think it's really important to actually have a clear understanding of what the current situation is and how things work on the ground.
Yes, and not only is it challenging, but a lot of people need to understand also in Maryland is a couple of years ago, 2018 legislative session, I believe it was, there was an omnibus bill on justice reinvestment. People in Maryland need to know that this prison population in Maryland has been reduced significantly. If my numbers are right, it's probably somewhere from around 25,000 in State Division of Correction at that time to today of about maybe 16, 17,000. Of course, that fluctuates. Local jails are no different. The population generally in local jails has decreased over the past couple of years with justice reinvestment, enacting of certain laws. But the difference is that often the population, which was much higher in number 15 years ago, was easier to manage because
Right.
The acuity of the problems today with substance abuse and mental illness has really, really, created a new dynamic of how we do what we do and how we manage. It's very complex. It's technical. It demands highly skilled people to do that work. And so you're right. I mean, for people to understand this is vitally important. And I'll tell you another good aspect of something very important about jails and prisons in Maryland is many states throughout the United States don't have standardization of standards of by which there's law or there are regulations within a state that govern how jails and prisons have to operate and are regularly audited and inspected by state officials. A lot of states do not have that construct in their government. Here in Maryland, we do. In Maryland, under the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services is the Maryland Commission on Correctional Standards. They have been around for a long time. They have well-established standards. They have constant revisions of the standards when it becomes necessary. But every 3 years, every jail and prison in the state of Maryland is audited, full top to bottom inspection and audit of the entire facility and everything we do. And that really standardizes how we do things. So one of the things I would say with that is that also refutes often some of the claims and some of the misconceptions that some people have about jails and prisons, that they're running the place any old kind of way, and there's no standardization and all these bad things are happening. It's just not the case. We have to operate by certain standards that the state mandates that are found in COMAR, and the law makes it clear that if they come in and audit and you are in non-compliance and there's an area where there is danger or grave concern, they can cease operations of that detention center and essentially force, the removal of the prisoners there and the inmates and transfer them somewhere else. So that's how serious it can be. The consequence can be for not meeting those standards. I don't think people have any grasp or understanding of that in Maryland. We have corrections in Maryland being standardized elevates how we do business to a pretty high level, and there's accountability. And so I think sometimes when advocacy groups are thinking that there's just these awful conditions in jails and prisons, well, I guess if you're looking at it from a global perspective and that's all you know, I guess, I guess that perspective is the one that a person takes. But here in Maryland, that is not what the landscape on corrections looks like. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's very important to the conversation.
It is very important, and Maryland certainly can be viewed as sort of a template, I think, for other states to institute these best practices and these standards across the board, so that you can look across the state and know exactly how things are running in each facility. So that is really, really good. So as we continue to get into a little bit of policy here, let's say now that, everybody listening to this podcast, every local and state lawmaker has decided they're going to go ahead and book the tour at their local correctional facility. They reach out to you and your colleagues. Once they show up, what are some of the issues that you'd want to talk with them about? What are some of the challenges that you feel like you need help with on the ground, and where local and state government can be helpful there and sort of give you the resources you need to provide all these services that you're talking about, and to make sure that people are safe in these facilities? What are some of your top issues to where you would say, hey, we need help right now. We're on fire, hair on fire here. This is what we need. We need you to step in and help us right away.
Yeah, that is going to vary from county to county, of course, because, budgets are just different, and resources are different. Some of your local jails, they have older facilities that are in some of the rural areas. It may be the time for conversation to be had about building a completely new facility, right? To be able to accommodate all of these demands and all of the needs in a current correctional world. Really, what I would show them and what I would really draw local officials or state officials' attention to if they came to Charles County Detention Center is the two big issues that we've covered pretty well, which are the people that are mentally ill being housed in a local jail and what that looks like. And the other thing would be substance abuse, because we are now under law that took full effect this January 1st of 2023. Every local jail has to provide a medical assisted treatment program for people who are identified with an SUD, a substance use disorder. The law states that it will be state funded. At this point in time, we haven't seen that funding, and so we're under heavy stress and with our budgets and resources to accommodate or be in compliance with this law. There are costs with medication. There are costs with counselors and professionals and certified doctors and local facilities, or partner facilities in the community that are substance use or substance abuse centers that you may have to enter into a memorandum of understandings with to provide for certain things like methadone. These are very complicated things, and at this point, it's sort of an unfunded mandate. We need funding to be able to fulfill the requirements of Correctional Services Article 9603, which requires the MAP program for local jails. So funding is big in that area. There's also funding connected to, it would be state funding connected to the other problem, which is the mentally ill being housed in a local jail. There are times when certain crimes are committed where that just has to be the case. There are other times where, as I said earlier, we become sort of the de facto mental health institution, the only place to safely keep a person until they can be transferred to a hospital. The problem lies at the state level. It's been clearly apparent for a decade at least, if not more, that the state has to seriously address the mental health hospitals how many beds we have in the state, the kind of resources that are necessary to run them. It is just one of those things that the state needs to take a close look at, and consider how they're going to move forward with, properly providing enough bed space in the state mental health hospitals, mental health hospitals, to accommodate these persons, so they can be properly cared for and treated.
Mm-hmm.
So
and to be compliant with that court order, that's 10 days.
Yeah,
the
court. When I get a court order for somebody to be moved and transferred for competency exam, it's 10 days. It says it right in the order, and it's simply not being accomplished. That's an everyday problem that I would draw the attention of the officials if they came to visit the Charles County Detention Center. Those are the two big areas that I'd like to have some in-depth conversation.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to have those conversations when we have hopefully a follow-up to this, where we're going to dive into some of the policies and some of the complications there. Because specifically with Matt, which was HB 116's implementation, it was just a very confusing funding scheme, and it really hasn't come to fruition the way that it was intended to. But yeah, I think that's definitely something, to take a look at and dive in on a little bit. And I would even say, outside of the policies in the jails, I think it's also, if you go a step further and say we need to look at moving some potential solutions further upstream, because we had things like court-ordered assisted outpatient treatment come up this session, and that didn't pass. And that's something that I think we would be the 48th or 49th state to do that. So we're kind of behind on that. And that would help keep severely mentally ill people out of the local jails.
The closest thing, Sarah, if I could mention, the closest thing we have to that right now in Maryland is some of the larger counties, and like George County is pretty well established. They've had it for several years. Is the closest thing we have to that is a mental health court, where some judges have taken up the mental health problem in particular counties and developed a mental health court. And the whole idea there is sort of what you're talking about. Try to keep it outpatient. Try to keep the person who's in the community functioning well, and sort of having some oversight a little bit by the court, and make sure there's follow through by some of the wraparound services in that particular county to avoid that person who is suffering from mental illness to come in contact with law enforcement. And so that's about the closest we have, but you're right. That's the kind of stuff we need to take a close look at, is how do we create law that helps to facilitate the right resources so that the mentally ill in our counties and community can stay away from being criminally involved.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would say, the other thing that came up this session is there were multiple court reform bills that could have minimized the number of people who end up in local facilities over minor nonviolent offenses like a vehicle infraction and the like. And they were trying to make it more accessible. So a virtual option, for your hearing, rather than needing to take off work or move away from some of your own commitments, your regular commitments, to have to be there. Because for people who are resource scarce, that can be really difficult, taking that day off of work or trying to find childcare or trying to find transportation. So there were multiple bills that would have helped sort of eliminate how quickly people are coming into the system, because you're just helping them access the system in a way that's able to facilitate their needs based on what their resources are.
It's going to take a new and revived commitment on the part of our lawmakers to say, look, we've been talking about both the substance abuse problem in Maryland and the mentally ill problem in Maryland for way too long. And it's going to take some serious consideration, some serious dialogue, and some serious, like I said, renewed commitment to say, we've got to fund these things properly, so we can, move forward in the right direction here.
Exactly. And that was the pressure point with the making the court hearings more accessible virtually, is that that's a very big technological lift that costs a lot of money. And it does seem to come back to the finances often.
Right. And I think that's a good point. And I think, forget the politics of the moment, right? We know that people are hyper politicized right now and polarized on the right and the left. And so just throw that out the window. And I think it's important to note that a lot of times MCAA is at the table opposing a bill, not because of the policy, right, but because of the budgetary constraints. We call it an unfunded mandate. MACO is often in the same position with a lot of different bills. It's not necessarily that we don't like the policy or that we wouldn't love to be able to provide a service. It's that the money isn't there. And especially when you start thinking about, medically assisted treatment, medication assisted treatment, right? You talked about Matt a little bit, and that the state funding hasn't shown up. I mean, when you start to add on top of that, body cameras, right? These things all cost money. So I think that sometimes, you could get a bad rap because you're at the table opposing a bill, and people think that, you're the scum of the earth because you don't want to do this great thing. But it really has nothing to do with that. It's all about money and, what the realities, like you said, are on the ground. So stuff like Matt and other issues where we really need to make a focus, and we got to get that stuff right, in my opinion, before we can try and do other things that might be great. But let's fix the issues that we know we have now, and let's fix the issues that we're supposed to be fixing, but the money hasn't shown up. So that's got to be a challenge for you, just like it is for MACO, right?
Yeah, and there's nothing more frustrating, I feel I'm very sympathetic to some of my colleagues, some other wardens in some of the rural counties that they're very limited on resources. And to have full-time medical staff under contract at their detention center, to have certain certified professionals and doctors and other things, it is near impossible for some of the rural counties to do such things. And so where does it leave them? And this is where the frustration sets in, is, this law takes effect fully this past January 1. And some of our rural counties especially are struggling still to get those MAT resources in place. They haven't been funded to do so. But then the most frustrating part is then when the heat starts coming from different directions on them, as if they, are being obstinate about it or not on board with following the law or making excuses. They just are left in this position where they don't have the funding and the resources necessary to carry it through and to be in compliance. And it's just very frustrating. So
yeah, and that's the soundbite, that flies typically, is they just don't want to do it, and that sells papers and that makes headlines. And it's like, that's just not the reality.
It's not the reality at all. They're doing the best that they can with the resources they can. And I can tell you, I know each and every one of these wards personally. They are experienced professionals who understand the law, understand what their obligations are, understand the need to help people. They want to do it, and they're in this very tough position where they just can't get it done. It's not obstinance for sure, and it's certainly not. They're not making excuses. They're under a lot of pressure. Budgetary constraints.
No doubt. I mean, I think you wouldn't be in this job if you didn't have a passion for what you do. And I think that extends to your colleagues across the state. Everybody wants to do the right thing. I cover budget and fiscal issues for MACO. I know there are a lot of capital concerns and operational costs that come with this. And, I see county budgets and the state budget. And, there's a lot of money out there that needs to be invested. And, budgets are priorities, right? So how do we elevate your needs to the top of the list? That's challenging. And so I don't want to hit our legislators at the state level too hard, because we know that, things are tough, and there are a lot of different programs and policy areas where you want to invest money. But it's really, really important, the work that you do, because this is about people's lives, right? If we can rehabilitate people and make sure that they have skills and resources to be successful, they're not going to have to end up back in a facility, and they're going to go be a productive resident in the state. So I think that this is one of the most important things we should be investing in, but oftentimes it's easy to lose sight of the work that you're doing every single day. And so that's why I think we really wanted to have you on. And I think we could have 10 follow-up episodes. I have so many things I want to talk to you about, including like new technologies and the role of security at local jails, right? How do drones play in, cell phones, all this new stuff, and how that makes your job even more difficult on top of everything else you're doing. So I would love to have you back on for part 2, 3, 4, if we can, to get into a lot of these issues more in depth. But particularly, I think it's important for people to understand that the mental health crisis is playing out in our local jails. We don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise to treat a lot of these folks. And of course, it's very, very expensive. So I think people need to remember that when we talk about local correctional facilities, the pressures that you're under, especially during COVID, right? We didn't even talk about that and the role that that had. So coming out of COVID, I think we can have a renewed conversation now and sort of get back to the issues at hand and the issues that have been ever present for a long time. And let's elevate that conversation and make sure that people are aware and that we can advocate on your behalf and the MCAA can advocate to get the funding that we need to make sure that we can have a positive impact on people's lives and that they can return to society and be productive.
That's right. I totally agree. It's been a pleasure, to speak on these topics today, and I would be, I would love to do this again and talk about some other topics. If I could, as we begin to kind of close, I would like to mention that this week is National Correctional Officer and Employees Week. Most of our detention centers celebrate this in a lot of different ways and really, celebrate our staff and celebrate what we do. Is dangerous work. It oftentimes is very challenging work. It demands a lot. And so, I want to elevate them and recognize all the correctional officers across the state and just thank them for their commitment, their service, their dedication to what they do. It's just really, really important, consequential work. I encourage them to take pride in what they do, keep doing it with excellence, strive for excellence in all they do. And, but yeah, I just wanted to say that because this week is an important week to us in our profession.
Yeah, here to that.
Here.
These folks are often underpaid, overworked, and they really are integral parts of the state and what they do to keep everybody safe every single day. Sarah, you cover these policy issues. You work with Director Foster very closely and a lot of his colleagues. I'll leave you with the last word before we go ahead and wrap it up.
Well, I would reiterate, definitely the excellence that people show in these jobs. It's a hard job. That certainly is something that needs to be honored. And so I'm happy that Brandon mentioned that for this week. And other than that, we've got to start talking about the policies. We've got to start talking about the problems with them and how we can make them better and what solutions are actually going to work. So I'm excited for the next handful of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 podcasts that we're gonna do the work, and we'll see what happens.
Sounds good. I look forward to it. Sarah, Kevin, thank you very much. I think we've got a lot of conversation in store in the future. So I would be glad to do that.
Well, Director Foster, we know you're a busy guy. We really appreciate you taking time to talk with us and sort of lay the foundation for what will turn into a multiple part series. But I think today our listeners have a lot to chew on, and maybe they can dive a little bit deeper. Hopefully they do reach out to their local correctional facility for a tour or just to get some more information, understand what's going on. But we really appreciate your time. We'll go ahead and leave it there for today. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook and Twitter. And then, of course, you should read the Conduit Street blog. But for Director Foster and Sarah Sample, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.